And this article came up from Michigan Ross School of Business, and it said that one of their professors had done some research that showed that there was a correlation between a person's usable emotional intelligence and their ability to read emotions in a group of people. So their ability to do what great comics and great actors do, it seems naturally, and that is to read the crowd or size up a crowd. And what this professor said was that if you could measure a person's ability to read a crowd, and that there was a very, very strong, useful correlation between that and the usable emotional intelligence, and that he had harnessed this into a method of assessing a person's usable emotional intelligence in a way that didn't require self-admission. And so it had an element of foolproofedness against it. Well, that gentleman, whom we've struggled to bring in over the last 2 minutes onto the call with our tech difficulties, was Dr. Jeffrey Sanchez Burks, I should say. That's the Irish in me coming out, calling you Burke. And he's professor of management and organizations at Michigan's Ross School of Business. Before I formally introduce him, we get going. Let me ask Aoife just to tell us a little bit about the admin today and how Q&A is going to work, and how we'll handle that until such time as we open up the floor to questions in the second half of this call.
Perfect. Thanks, Derek. So welcome, everyone. So as we shared in the invitation, today we're going to have a 25-30-minute chat between Derek and Jeffrey, and then we're going to open up the floor for questions. So as we're going through the content today, if you think of questions you'd like to ask, feel free to type them. You'll see a chat box on the bottom right side of your screen. You can type them in there as they pop into your mind. You also have a Q&A box on the bottom part of your screen. So what we'll do is, there's no need to worry. We'll have plenty of time for questions and answers today. So type them in as they pop into your mind, and I will be gathering those and posing them to Derek and Jeffrey when we get to that midpoint session. So very easy to use. If anyone has trouble with sound, just send me a message in that chat box as well, and we'll make sure you're taken care of. Okay.
Wonderful. Thank you, Aoife. We'll see you at in the second half. So let me tell you a little bit about Jeffrey. Jeffrey's a behavioral scientist, and he's the professor of management and organizations at the Stephen Ross School of Business at the University of Michigan. He's a TEDx speaker whose research has been featured in the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, Harvard Business Review, and on National Public Radio in the United States. From our point of view, most importantly, Jeffrey is what one of my lecturers would have admiringly called a practical man, in that his research is designed to be used in the real world of business. And in that regard, he has taught leaders in more than 30 countries worldwide in sectors as diverse as technology, financial services, consulting, arts, entertainment, government intelligence, manufacturing, and healthcare. So let me close my screen and welcome Jeffrey on. So Jeffrey, you're very, very welcome.
Hello, thank you so much. And thank you for taking that flight off.
You didn't like that? I thought that was a pretty darn good one.
Anyway,
here you go. Hey, so listen, great to have you on board. So tell me, how did you come anyway to be studying emotional intelligence? What's the story of the journey into that?
I think it began early in my career when I started to try to understand how culture shaped the way people collaborate, and what are some of the things that cause some troubles, even when people have good intentions. Okay. And early on, one of the dimensions I sort of stumbled upon was differences in attunement to the social emotional dynamics in a workplace. And cultures differed tremendously on how attuned they were. We've ultimately now discovered that what happens is in some cultures, their emotional intelligence scores go down in the work context. Okay. And so it's dynamic depending on the situation. And often that has to do with the way in which professionalism can be defined. So you can define professionalism as focus on the task, not the people, but you could alternatively define professionalism as remain attuned to the task, but also to the subtleties of the situation. And you'll see this in different regions. So that work really led me on a journey of trying to understand much more about this attunement to emotions and social dynamics. And somewhere along the way, it became sort of had this discovery that nobody had really done any work on a low-hanging fruit question, which is, what do we know about people's ability to not just process other individuals' emotional cues, but how to understand emotions more holistically, say in a group or a team or a business unit?
Right.
And it was a fairly obvious question, but we had no empirical work. And then as I started to develop research in this area and try to come up with metrics on how to capture it, I realized perhaps why it hadn't been done. It's quite difficult conceptually and methodologically. But anyway, so that's kind of how I got into this area.
Yeah, and tell me the idea, the leap into what ultimately became the emotional aperture method. I mean, how did you arrive at the point where you said, hey, you know what? Some people are great at reading a crowd, and that gives that must be a dimension or must be an indicator of emotional intelligence. How do you make that leap? I mean, I can imagine once you make it, it's tough anyway, but...
Yeah, I was talking with a colleague from another school who is a more sort of macro sociologist who really thinks about institutions, not social psychological dynamics. And we were sort of teasing one another about the relevance of the research. And he was teasing me basically that, well, you know, in an organization, it's not just individual interactions. There's much more happening at a broader scale. And then basically the light bulb popped on. It's like, you're right. Individuals don't actually have the luxury of having one-on-one interactions all the time. You have to read the room. And if you look beyond even just a typical business context, you look when a musician or an actor is working the room, or comedians or business leaders are just navigating in a team, there's this need to not just, or in a classroom, to not teach to individuals, but to understand how the dynamics of the room are changing so that you can better manage that. It became clear that it became an obsession, essentially, to try to understand that. And then as we collected data, we had some pretty compelling insights that in order to be seen as an effective leader, you indeed have to be able to accurately understand the emotional patterns in a group. And interestingly enough, this is very modestly related to ability to read one individual. So just because you may be good at reading one individual doesn't necessarily translate you'll be good at reading the room. It's akin to looking at one of those pointillist paintings, a Monet, and somebody who's very good at seeing the purple dots there versus somebody who can see the scan. So it really requires a different way of processing the situation.
So why did you call it, or why did it end up being the emotional aperture method?
Yeah, beyond the obvious attractiveness of French words in academic terms like entrepreneurship and bricolage. Being an amateur photographer, is very familiar with the aperture setting, and that changes your depth of focus. So you can either bring one individual in focus and everyone else is a blur, or you can change that depth of focus with the aperture setting to bring everybody essentially into focus. So I was trying to capture sort of an analog to something that may or may not be familiar with everyone, especially now with digital photography, but tries to accurately capture this shifting of your depth of focus.
Okay. So let's say, so basically what your research shows and what the ultimate application that we're going to look at in a couple of minutes shows is that somebody who can read a crowd of people, who can notice the emotions as they ebb and flow in a group of people, tends to have good, usable, accessible emotional intelligence. So if you can measure one's ability to read affect in a group of people, well, then you're measuring something that has a good, strong correlation to their usable emotional intelligence. Is that correct?
Yes, and I think the way to really understand the real big challenge of doing this is when you are trying to stay attuned to the emotional dynamics in a group, a couple of things are working against you. Okay. Number one, emotional reactions, authentic reactions. Say you're talking about moving into a new market, or you're going to have this major disruptor coming into your industry. Any sort of announcement, people are going to have a reaction, most people. Could be positive, could be negative, could be surprise, confused, fear. These are very fleeting reactions. You only get a glimpse of them in people's face, in their body movements. And if you were to try to scan a room, by the time you got to the end, those reactions are gone. They may be hidden because people don't want you to see this, or just because the very nature of emotional expressions are not static like a comic, they flash.
Yeah.
So you have to be able to really holistically sort of get a sense of the room and do this in an ongoing fashion to capture these fleeting reactions. The other difficulty, as I mentioned, was people don't necessarily want you to see the reactions.
Sure.
And so they can quickly try to mask them. So it's not something that's just there easy to see. It does require an ability to remain in tune with kind of the task that you're doing at hand, but not to over-calibrate and focus on one specific individual, but really stay attuned to the room.
Very good. And let me share the screen, because what I just want to show folks is on this next one. I'll get rid of that picture, Jeffrey, don't worry. On this next one. So this is where we start to look at how did you go about actually implementing this. And 3-4 years ago, you had a research version of this up online, which is the thing that really got my socks kind of rolling up and down. How did you land at the actual way that the assessment is done, or the way that you would measure this ability? How did you end up with this sort of approach?
That was a journey indeed. Methodologically, we struggled with trying to come up with a way to capture the real experience of reading a group. As you can imagine, you could just put a picture of a group, as you see here, a static image, but that wouldn't really capture your ability to read a group, just to read single individuals and then count positive reaction or negative reaction. And if you look at sort of the current way emotion recognition is measured, it's just that way. You see a face. Sometimes the face flashes, but you just see one face, and that's it. So we needed a way in which you could see a group kind of before and after something had happened. You need to be able to read people's baseline emotions. You know, somebody who's been very, had a very difficult life, for example, may have negative emotions looking even when they're not feeling it. And so maybe if they didn't have a reaction, you would think they had a negative reaction. So you need to be able to see what people's face looks like, just baseline, and then be able to have a reaction. And we wanted to come up with a very well-validated measure. So we took other faces that had been used in emotion recognition research for individuals, and we created essentially like a paper doll type of paradigm where we took these faces that had been validated, constructed them, as you see here, but in the old version, we then took pictures of people's bodies with permission, and then we cut and paste the heads onto bodies, and then we create different, essentially 2-frame movies where you'd see the person, the group, then see the reaction, and then it would disappear. And you were asked just a few questions, and we would do this repeatedly. In the new measure, we actually have just real people, their body and faces, so you can get full expression of this. And still in each movie, the people that are put in there are randomized. So each time you can't like learn the measure. Each time it sort of gives you a good assessment of your ability to read this. And so if you look on the screen here, it doesn't really do justice to the measure, because what would happen is you would be given some instructions. You would see the top image very briefly, half a second. It would then change to the second image down below, and then that would disappear. So you'd see a group, and then you'd see the reaction disappear. And then you'd be asked, okay, so how did they go? And initially, we tried to have people report, you know, how much anger was in the group, how much contempt, how much happiness, surprise. And we discovered in our sort of early prototyping and development of the measure that was just ridiculous. You would ask them a question, they would come up with an answer, but there's no way people are processing at such level of detail. And we discovered the basic gist of what you're trying to get from people is, well, what proportion had a positive reaction? What proportion had a negative reaction? And because some people don't have a reaction, as in real life, those two are not perfectly correlated. So they're independent measures. And that's where we landed on a measure that we could construct multiple of these movies. We wanted to have a lot of diversity in terms of culture, ethnicity, gender. We put it in sort of realistic context, as you might see this. And then just ask a couple of questions and then do this repeatedly over multiple items to get some reliability on it.
Okay. And by the way, on the next slide, we have a little video that shows some of the videos and shows how it works. But the basic approach is the four folks are showed up the top here, and then it's assumed that something has happened. You've said something, some incident has happened, and then that has changed the expression on their faces. And so it's let me just get this. So basically, we're able to, by looking at multiple of those movies and looking at the changes and the person's ability to detect those changes across multiple of those movies, we're able to show direct correlations with self-awareness and say, this person has this level of self-awareness, empathy, behavioral agility, resilience, etc. Is that correct?
Yeah. Interestingly enough, it's not correlated with standard intelligence. So if you study this, for example, in a student population, it doesn't correlate with their grade point average or their college entrance exam scores. It's not really correlated that highly with personality.
Okay.
But what you do find is that people who do poorly on this measure and are extroverts have bad outcomes, because essentially they're acting on bad information. So these are people who are out really dynamic, really working with people, but are not reading the group correctly. So it's they're acting on bad information.
Yeah. So they got very bad sights or very, very bad focus and a tremendous ability to take a shot anyway.
Yeah, we've also found, so this particular version has 4 people groups. We've also published research showing that you could create like an 8-person group. We didn't do every possible combination, but just to see, is it something that's not just looking at a small group, but even a broader group? And we found similar effects. So this sort of way of capturing emotional aperture seems to be having good coverage in sort of the broader concept of being able to read groups and teams.
Okay. So let's have a look at one of those videos. I'm going to click now in a moment, and just for the folks who are listening in, there's as Jeffrey said, you would be presented with a series of these short video or these short movies where you've got 4 people who have a particular set of expressions on their faces, and then the assumption is something happened to change that. And you need to be able to detect and quantify how many faces changed in what direction. But let's give you an example, and then we'll give you an opportunity to see how well you do against it yourself. So let's just start this one and give you an example of how it works. Here we go. So let's just go with that again so that you can see it, because it's very fast. So you're going to see the picture of the 4 folks coming up. Keep your eye on them, and then you're going to see that there's a change in it. And what you're looking to do is see what that change is. And then the assessment asks you, as Jeffrey said, to say where were the changes. So how many of the folks in the group had positive reactions? How many had negative reactions? And then you move on to the next group. And any comments or elucidation that you put in there, Jeffrey?
Yeah. So what we tried to calibrate the time in which you would see the faces to be so quick that you could not count. Again, otherwise that would just be a counting task. However, what we found is that people walk away from the test feeling that they were guessing, because they said, I don't know what was happening. But yet, if you look at the scores, they're reliably, majority of the population, reliably more accurate than chance. So it turns out this measure is capturing people's ability, not people's perception of their ability. It's a difficult task, but it's something that is capturing your ability to read the room, even and in sort of in the real world way, because in the real world you wouldn't be able to say, well, I know for sure this is exactly the proportions. And of course, we have multiple movies, so if you get it wrong on the first one, that your whole score is not going to be based on that. But over a number of these items, then you can get a reliable measure on it. So what I've found in talking with people, I've had people on both extremes. I've had, in the early days, some folks come and they scored absolutely horribly. And we're so worried. And so I asked them, what was your strategy? It's like, oh, my strategy was to count from left to right as quickly as possible. Essentially not looking holistically. Try again. And sure enough, their score was different. So it was more reliable. I've also had people anecdotally who've aced it. Not many who would get a perfect score. And interesting, and this is more anecdotal information, essentially, these are people who are highly tuned. They are very successful. They have lots of data that corroborates their ability and success in leading teams and groups and understanding the emotional dynamics, the tenor and tempo of the group. So anecdotal information seems to be consistent with more methodologically rigorous data we've collected, that this measure captures this phenomena. Of course, there may be other ways to do this, but at least we have bottled one reliable way to capture a construct, an emotional intelligence skill that previously we didn't know much about or couldn't assess.
Very good. And folks, we're going to give you an opportunity to try one of these now in a moment. Well, in a moment, sorry, not that one. We're going to go on to the next one. So see if you can answer this one for real. So Jeffrey, do you want to give them, the instructions just as to what they should at this point?
So in the test, often people will get some practice items so you become familiar with the paradigm. Effectively, what you're told is that you're going to see a group right before and right after something has happened. So it's a generic instruction. You could, of course, think about, well, they're reacting to an organizational change. But for these items, you're going to see a group before and after something happened, and then you'll just be asked to let us know what proportion of the group, if any, had a positive or negative reaction.
Okay. So with that in mind, folks, keep your eyes peeled. I'm going to press play. It's going to flash up before you very quickly. Here we go. Okay. So how many people do you think had positive reactions? How many people do you think had negative reactions? So do me a favor and post those up into the chat now before we reveal what the correct answers were. And Aoife will bring those on at the end of the day. She'll have a look at the chat, and she'll have a look at the resolution when we bring it out. But while you're doing that, let me ask Jeffrey, because you mentioned earlier on, you mentioned the word validation, and most of our audience here today are coaches, consultants, and trainers, and they'll have experience of some kind with assessment. And they know that one of the things the clients very often ask is, so how is this validated? How do you know it works? In words that somebody like me would understand, how do you go about validating something as complex as this? How did you prove that this worked? Because I know the numbers on it are very, very solid.
Yeah, so once we had the basic paradigm and we had the movies flashing in a way that you couldn't just count, the next thing was to have populations take this test and take other tests. For example, some of the standard ways of capturing people's ability to read individual faces, getting their cognitive intelligence scores, doing correlations like that, creating an 8-measure, seeing if people's ability to read this. We also did some experiments where we wanted to see if this emotional intelligence, which requires broadly capturing the room, is related to other ways that other tasks that require people to broadly read this. So, for example, there's some old psychological tests where you can measure people's ability to read, to see either like individual letters. So if you imagine a T, but it's made with letter O's.
Okay.
What do you see first? The T, which means you're processing the big picture, or the O's. And it's correlated quite strongly with those types of tasks. So the way of going validation, convergent discriminant ways of validating it, essentially, does it relate to things it should relate to? Okay. Is it independent from things it should relate to? That helped us understand, okay, this is a measure that seems to be on point with conceptually how it was developed. But then the real test was, does it matter?
Yeah.
In that test, what we did is we collected over some period of time data from global executives. These were people who were taking some executive education classes around the world.
Okay.
And then we'd have their subordinates. We'd ask them to send their subordinates a link that would anonymously evaluate them in terms of their transformational leadership. And for those familiar with that particular concept, transformational leadership has to do with the leader's ability to respond and be attuned to how the group is feeling, their level of engagement, not necessarily just their competence, but building up morale, cohesion.
Sure.
In other words, all of the things that you would think would require being able to accurately understand the group.
Right.
And so the real big test was then to see if the leader's score on this assessment would predict their leadership in the eyes of their subordinate. So an independent measure of that.
Yeah.
And that was really where we got excited, because now we finally had evidence that it mattered. We had a valid measure, and now we showed that it actually mattered, and mattered in ways that contribute additional insight. So for example, a leader's ability to read individuals has been shown previously to be important.
Okay.
We show that is true, but above and beyond that, emotional aperture uniquely predicts additional variation in a leader's ability to be a transformational leader.
Okay, so bottom line, if I scored high in this and I said, hey Jeffrey, I'm really delighted, I'm up there at the 70-80% mark, you'd be saying to me that is really strongly indicative of your ability to operate in an environment where you're required to show up as a transformational leader, where you're required to bring people on board, motivate them, make them feel like they're seen, and so on.
Yes, and often people who score particularly well or particularly poorly, in some ways what this does is it helps them understand why they typically do very well or very poorly. In other words, they often have a sense, yeah, I don't do well. Okay, now I can at least understand part of what's happening, because I'm not paying attention. So it's like a three-step process. Number one, you have to understand that reading people's emotions is important.
Yeah.
For some, that's a big insight. Then you have to be able to multitask, focus on the emotions and, of course, the task at hand.
Yeah.
Then you need to be able to understand the importance of staying in tune to the group, not just focusing on one or two individuals who may approve or disapprove. So those three things are really required. So what we've found is that this test opens up a really helpful conversation.
Yeah, yeah. And tell me, how has it been used heretofore? You obviously, in the research, you've used it in a lot of countries around the world with people who are about to go on programs and so on. And Genos and yourself are just about to launch a collaborative version of it that'll be used in pre-development and pre-hiring and so on. How has it been used to date?
Yeah, so a number of schools, MBA programs at sort of elite schools in the US, at least to begin with, have been using this, actually even in Europe, over at INSEAD as well, have been incorporating this into their MBA programs as part of their training and development around emotional intelligence. So a number of organizations have started to dabble in this with the earlier version of it, and been used to augment a lot of the conversations around emotional intelligence development.
Okay. Well, then let me just share the screen again. While people have, I purposely didn't show it to them a second time, Jeffrey, because I reckon you likely wouldn't approve of that. So let us move on and let's tell them the resolution, what the correct answers were on this particular one before we go into the Q&A in a moment. So if you said, okay, there we go. So if you said that 2 of them went negative, 2 of them went positive, well, then you absolutely nailed it. So 2 of the 4 displayed positive reactions, and 2 of the 4 displayed negative reactions to it. And I think the lady on the left with that disgust feature, she really nailed it, didn't she? My God. But so in the test itself, you'd be presented with a large number of these, which, as you say, have the characters randomized, so somebody can't come out and tell their buddy how to go in and ace it, or you can't. You can get past the sort of practice, the value of practice in that way, right?
Yeah, absolutely. The idea here was, and when you see the faces like this, they very much look like a caricature.
Yes.
To get the measure, we needed pretty broad expressions, but they flashed so quickly so that you could at least process this information. In the real world, again, expressions of disgust, if somebody says we're closing your department, their reaction could be very quick. They may not even know it. That's the thing, is people's reactions show very quickly, even when they're not intentionally showing it. In fact, most of the time our reactions are spontaneous, authentic ones, and then maybe we keep it if we understand what we're showing. So we're surprised and happy. We may then continue to have that expression to communicate to the other person intentionally, even though we've already unintentionally communicated to the person.
Okay, and I am absolutely certain that some of the folks on the call will be familiar with Paul Ekman's work. So when you talk about those expressions flashing up, you're really talking about the same thing, the micro expressions that are involuntarily shared in a flash of a second.
Absolutely. I was very inspired by his measure that he developed much more later on. So the early images people would use in their emotional intelligence test, and the DANVA uses a similar paradigm. But then he had come up with sort of micro expression test. Yeah. And I was very much inspired by the use of a very quick flash of an emotional expression to assess it. Yeah. And so that was a big inspiration in this measure. But there, it's still just a flash of an individual. I combined that with all of this other research showing that you really need to understand, and actually that other research was based on Ekman's work as well, you really need to understand people's baseline reaction. You need to sort of see what their natural face is in order to understand a reaction. So if you try to code accurately a person's emotions, even on a still image, if you have a validated assessment of that, you need to see a change. You're coding emotional expressions, not a static emotion.
Okay. So from a practical point of view, and we'll turn over now and take the questions from the folks who are sitting patiently waiting to hop in. From a practical point of view, what this means is that you now have a measure that can be used pre-hire or pre-programmed, for example, with somebody that is not fakeable because it's testing directly ability and it's not relying on a self-admission and so on and so forth. And it seems to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, that this is pretty unique. I mean, the only other thing that I've ever heard about that measures ability out there and emotions is the very, very ancient mesquite, the Meyer-Salavi, which is really, really old and measures something completely different. Is it as unique as it seemed to me?
Yeah, the mesquite is tricky because really the question about accuracy comes up a lot on all measures of emotional intelligence, or at least motion recognition.
Right.
And in the mesquite, accurate is defined as the convergence between what you think is happening and what everyone else who's taken this test think.
Okay.
And you know, the crowd has some intelligence, but it's really you could think of the mesquite in a way as as a cultural intelligence test.
Okay.
So Americans score higher than folks around East Asia.
Right.
Accuracy is defined and normed on a North American sample. So it's a little bit tricky with those types of measures. Other measures accuracy is defined by whether you're seeing what could be coded with the muscles are doing in the face. This measure relies more on that. So accuracy here is defined by your ability to detect emotional expressions that have widely been agreed are expressed with certain muscle movements.
Okay.
And at a group level. So it's true. I mean, I, as a researcher, I want more work to be done on this. Certainly different measures could be developed on this, and I hope it becomes a very rich research area. But right now, this is the only measure that is created for this. I guess I could note one of the ways in which we developed this that made it very useful for the real world right away is that study where we were going to use executives globally to do this forced me to basically develop a measure that could meet the constraints of such folks, meaning they had very little time, so, or very little patience, little time and little patience, so it needed to be as brief as possible. They were globally distributed, so I needed to come up with a paradigm that could be online. That required some technical requirements to download the images because they couldn't just show up at various speeds given your bandwidth. And then it had to have enough realism that people wouldn't be, for example, looking at cartoons and think this is sort of a silly task.
Yeah.
So interestingly enough, the constraints of where I was doing my research accelerated the development of a measure that had was well suited for the real world.
Yeah. Okay, well then, thank you, Jeffrey. Let me close off the screen share here. And let me bring Aoife back online with her video. And Aoife, I saw the question or the chat popping away there. Have we some questions for Jeffrey?
We do indeed. Okay. So thanks, Jeffrey. First question there. So when we get an assessment like this, what can someone do with the results? Is there guidance on how to develop someone's observation or and/or reading a room?
So what we've done when we've used it, for example, in the classroom or in a broad training, is we use this assessment very early on. So they kind of collect it before we've had a discussion about emotional intelligence. And then people get sort of a sense of the concept, the data about it. They look at their scores, and then we have a conversation about it. And we try to look for other examples in their life that can help give them moments of realization that, yeah, I guess I have focused maybe too much on this one person who I was worried about their approval, for example, and ignored everyone else in there. We're starting to do work, say, with entrepreneurs who are pitching to judges, who need to focus on the room, not just one or two people. And so we've used it in a conversation, and then what people have done is later on, come up with a plan for them to try to be much more attuned to group emotions. And then we sort of follow up on them, and they can often take the test again and sort of track improvement. So that the measure is, as was mentioned, is designed so you can take it multiple times, and you shouldn't have a real practice effect. Mm-hmm. So you come up with a developmental plan and then be able to track your success at that. People who scored very low, as I mentioned before, we have a conversation about whether they're even paying attention to people while doing their work. And so I'm like, no, I had emotional blinders on, essentially. And we show them the research that can prevent any emotional intelligence from being deployed in the workplace. There was a question about whether we've tracked leaders over time. We haven't yet. That's a great research question that we should do. What we had done in that one study was one slice of time, though the transformational leadership evaluation, of course, was based on their experience with their leader over time, not at one particular moment.
Mm-hmm. Gotcha. Okay. And just earlier you touched on that something was coming out with Genos. If somebody wanted to try this now, or can you share a little bit more about what's upcoming?
Yeah, Deiric, do you want to take this one, or I can?
I'm happy for you to take it. I mean, basically, we're within an ass's roar, as they would say in Ireland, of pushing it out there. It's already going out to some larger users who are integrating it onto their platforms. We're going to be introducing it for Genos certified practitioners as another option that they can bring to market. So it'll be a different platform to the Genos platform. It's a separate organization producing this assessment. And it will give you the ability to run this in pre-hire, pre-program sort of situations. It takes, as far as I remember, in the Genos version, and you can correct me on this if I'm wrong, Jeffrey, 10 or 11 minutes to complete, right?
Yeah, and that's been true of the prior measure, but also the data showing how much time it's taken. Hundreds of people who have taken the new measure, it's about 10 minutes.
Yeah. Which is really, and I know that there's a lot of people looking at this thinking, ooh, yeah, and for a pre-hire situation, obviously the fact that it's not fakeable, that it's an ability test of sorts, is very, very attractive. So yeah, we will be announcing separately how you can get access to that. But if you're a Genos EI practitioner, we'll be reaching out to you on that separately. If you're not, just reach out to us afterwards. We'll be writing to you with a copy of the recording, and we'll tell you how you can get access to it. So, yeah. Was there another question on there, Ava?
Yeah. This is a little away from the workplace side of things, but we're wondering, is this something employed by stage artists, such as hypnotists, to gauge and identify moods and reactions? What are your thoughts?
I haven't had a lot of experience with hypnotists, but stage artists, yes. So one of the things we actually have done we're starting to do some interesting work, looking both at people's ability, say, coming up with creative ideas, to know which of their ideas are creative. And we've looked, say, at stand-up comedians and musicians playing new songs in sort of open mic moments. And we have them tell us what songs they're going to play, what jokes they're going to tell. And then we look at the laughter or the applause in the room as the measure of how successful it was. Right. And now we're starting to ask questions about whether a comedian or musician's ability to read the room, to be attuned to those emotional dynamics, allows them to adjust in a positive way. Because in these contexts, it's rarely a static staged performance, it's not staged, scripted performance, or tightly scripted performance. In these contexts, people make adjustments in real time based on what's going on in the crowd. So the hypothesis would be, yeah, that, for example, stand-up comedians and musicians who have flexibility in their sets, or even just flexibility in how they're going to execute their music, definitely the strong prediction is their emotional aperture scores would predict their success in that. It's a great question. Actually, make a note of this one.
Interesting.
Low-hanging fruit for my PhD students.
Exactly. Thank you. And then we've been discussing, leaders so far in transformational leadership. Is this something that you feel, if a coach or a trainer is working with a group of people, say, that aren't in a leadership position? Is this something that if they're working to develop their emotional intelligence, they should also incorporate this measure in as well? Because it's just as important for people to be able to, react and read the room in that sense, even if they're not in a leadership position.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think I didn't mention this before. When you're thinking about reading a group, it may simply be that you're a member of a team, which is ubiquitous in the modern workplace. And in order to successfully navigate a team requires being attuned to others, whether you're the leader or not. There's some interesting work on collective intelligence. And that work shows, it's coming out of MIT, that work shows that one of the best predictors of collective intelligence, meaning a group can be given almost any task and they'll succeed on average more than other groups, is their ability to be emotionally attuned. And I think that's a wonderful context to which to understand beyond leadership. It's when you're in social environments, it is beneficial to understand the dynamics of the group. A lot is unspoken. A lot can be picked up from these subtle cues. Whether, for example, the group is having very different reactions, that might be an indicator there's some confusion and there needs to be a moment to sort of come together and focus. Or if there's enough energy, now we can move to executing the task. Or maybe there's too much complacency in the moment and people need to get agitated. Some negative information may need to be brought into the situation in order to get motivated to change. All of these situations require members, arguably all the members, but any one member in a team, to be attuned to how the group is feeling, if not just to lead them, as to navigate themselves. Excuse me. Oh, sorry.
God bless you. There's something you said earlier, Jeffrey, I beg your pardon. There was something you said earlier that really caught my attention. You said that, and it sounded like it was maybe a recurring theme, because you said that sometimes people realize, oh, I just haven't been paying attention to this, and probably because they just didn't feel that it was quite as important as maybe other stuff that was going on. Is that a recurring theme in the folks that you worked in this, that they just weren't paying attention?
Yeah, before I got into doing work in emotional aperture, a number of years were spent trying to understand why, when, and how people were attuned to emotions generally in professional contexts. And the major theme was there's many cultures of professionalism where not using your emotional intelligence is part of the definition of professionalism. So focus on the task. Don't pay attention to how I feel about it. Just give me the information. Leave your things that you might do outside the workplace. Just be very task focused. Don't worry about. So Gallup has a measure, the Q12, that measures engagement globally. One of their questions asks, do you have a friend at work? And that's a question they get a lot of kickback. A lot of organizations say, no, I don't want to ask that question. I don't want to encourage friendships. We're here is a professional environment. And so basically what we are finding, as I think I previewed before, is that people's emotional intelligence goes down in the workplace. And that actually is a really helpful insight. Yeah. Because what it means is that you don't necessarily need to build brand new competencies to get people emotionally intelligent. You need a training that helps people leverage what they already have, but they're not using. And emotional intelligence practitioners and researchers have often thought of it as very static. whatever level you are, you have that. So too is the conversation about emotional aperture. Being able to have this on your radar is as important as being able to do it well. And taking the measure essentially takes care of both issues.
Yeah, and actually it puts in mind, it brings to mind is I think it's the Gestalt people who say awareness is curative. So just the fact that somebody says, hey man, you're not able to read these faces in a group is probably enough just to get people to stop for a beat and start to try and read these faces in a group and pay attention to the affect.
Yeah.
So somebody could go through the EAM, they could get their score, they could go away with the intent of paying more attention, and there's guidance given in the report for how you can go about that. But they could pay more attention over a period of months and come back and do the test again, and it wouldn't be, there's no downside to doing that, right?
No, not at all. In fact, as you mentioned, we created a report for folks who take it. It's possible to get this report that helps people understand what their score means, and then what are things you can do to improve your ability in this area.
Yeah, and we'll send we'll get a sample of that out to the folks who've attended this and who get the recording as well. Is there anything else, Jeffrey? Just thinking about this, because obviously, and I think at the heart of every successful piece of research is obsession. I love the fact that you mentioned this became an obsession. Given that it is your obsession, is there anything else that we should be telling folks on the call that hasn't been asked in the question or that we haven't surfaced yet?
I don't know. I think one of the great benefits I have as in my professor life and teacher role is really trying to inspire people to think new thoughts and to better accomplish the things they care about.
Yeah.
And in that endeavor, having people be more attuned to others, not just for the sake of paying attention to others, but being able to better navigate, manage, and lead social dynamics is part and parcel of the endeavor of being successful and inspiring and teaching others. And so when I work with anyone, I basically have the philosophy that they're teachers also, because that's what everything is about, is inspiring and helping others to mobilize what needs to be done for the organization or to accomplish things that you're trying to do to build your legacy. And this idea of paying attention to the emotional dynamics of groups and situations fits very well within that. Fortunately, we now have a measure to do this. There's a growing body of research behind it. And thank goodness the measure is so quick and easy. It's not a massive barrier. I mean, there's some tests out there which are bizarre. And there are measures that are not bizarre but take forever. And this one is pretty to the point. It captures exactly this thing, nothing more, nothing less. And then a lot of conversations can be had from that. Or in terms of selection, just a way of sort of helping filter out people who might be particularly good at a task that is helpful for the job. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you. We have one more question there, Deiric. Sorry.
I see that.
Yeah, Deiric was asking, can developing this skill be used or considered as a form of crowd manipulation?
I think the word manipulation can be interpreted multiple ways, just like the word influence. In order to influence people, it's possible to influence people for goals that may not meet the group, but to meet your own. I think that's maybe when we call it manipulation, or when they're not aware of it. When a leader tries to motivate and corral everyone up because they know that the task ahead is going to be difficult, do we call it influence or manipulation? It's a judgment call on that. But for sure, they're manipulating or influencing the emotional dynamics of a group. So it's basically knowledge. It's knowledge about what's happening in the group emotionally, affectively. And what people do with that is really a separate question. It's an important one, but I don't know if this was the meaning of the word manipulation in there. But it's not a form of crowd manipulation. It's a piece of knowledge that can be used.
Thanks, Thank you, Jeffrey. One last one there just came in as well. Arnab is asking, is the emotional intelligence / perception purely visual, or can this be applied at a finer level? Can there be non-visual cues as well?
It's a wonderful question. I'm not sure whether finer is the right word, but at different levels in different modalities. And I think the question is a resounding yes. The research and the methodologies developed to capture emotions at, say, an audio level are more complex and difficult. I wanted to capture all modalities, was realizing there's going to need to be more work to be done at that level. But absolutely, you can close your eyes and listen to a crowd watch an emotional movie, and you can hear the whimpers, the snickers, the laughter. So emotional cues are definitely coming through audio channels. This measure doesn't capture that. It's an open empirical question. If you're good at one channel, are you good at another channel? But the little work that's out there on emotional cues at an audio level really are a very ivory tower university level, and we still have yet, and I think it's an important direction for us, to be able to bottle assessments at that level, maybe finer level, in a way that people in everyday life can actually take. So it's a great question, and these measures need to be developed.
Thank you. Thank you.
So bottom line, Jeffrey, you could have several lifetimes of sessions chasing after the various different modalities in just this one area.
Yeah, there was actually a paper published by a colleague here some years ago showing that market volatility can be predicted by audio volatility, if you will, on the trading floor. So much like you get a sense that something's about to happen, you can hear the crowd and movement. Yeah. There's definitely information there. But we know most about the face because going all the way back to Darwin, perhaps even further, there's been intense study and understanding on that. So it's the way to begin the research, but I love the idea of trying to look at the audio level as well.
Mm-hmm.
Well, just to add to your body of research there, Jeffrey, we had, let me see, we had 60% of the people who chose to answer got the 50-50 correct on that one item.
Reliably accurate.
Not everybody went for it.
And it's definitely not a Rorschach. I mean, a one-item test.
Yeah.
No one should act on that information alone.
No, for sure. Well, listen, Aoife, I don't think we have any other questions there.
That's it for now. We're good.
Well, that's great. Well, listen, Jeffrey, it only remains to say thank you very much. Really appreciate the time. What a fascinating topic it is. And to the people who are on the call, if you want to do a test drive, just let Aoife know, and we'll give you a link so that you can go along and do exactly that and go through the full thing instead of, as Jeffrey said, instead of making any decisions on the basis of that single one-item test. So once again, folks, thank you everybody who's attended, but most especially Jeffrey, thank you very much indeed. Really do appreciate your time.
Thank you all. Thanks for the questions. It's wonderful to talk about this stuff.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Thanks, folks. Take care.